Hi folks, welcome to Dan Snow's History Hit. It is the most important thing that has ever happened to the human race. So argues my guest today, and I think I agree with him. Today we're diving into a revolution, not one marked by gunfire and guillotines, although there was a bit of that, but mostly marked by steam and steel. A transformation so profound it redefined how humans live, work, and think. 200 years ago, the fastest we humans could reliably get around was at the speed of a galloping horse. Now, we're flying drones on Mars. We're talking about the Industrial Revolution. What happened? Why on earth did it begin in Britain of all places? What mix of geography, politics, innovation and ambition turned this small island into an engine room of global change? And how did the inventions and the upheavals in coal mines and textile mills ripple outwards to touch every corner of the globe? Joining us is Duncan Weldon. He's a great friend of the podcast, been on before many times. He's a journalist, writer, author of 200 Years of Muddling Through, which is fabulous. He is going to explain how this great turning point in history unfolded and how we're still in it. We're still in the Industrial Revolution. It still powers the world we live in today. Duncan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Duncan, great to see you, man. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
You've always said something that stuck in my mind, that basically human history can be divided into two bits, and that's pre- and post-industrial revolution. Is that how big it is in your mind?
That's absolutely how big it is in my mind, and it makes human history much simpler if you've only got two parts before and after the Industrial Revolution. But I think it's fair. You know, the world before the Industrial Revolution looked very different to the world afterwards, the world, you know, we live in, the world we're used to. The world before the Industrial Revolution was a world in sort of economic and social terms of fundamental continuity, where people's lives looked most of the time quite similar to their parents' lives, quite similar to their grandparents' lives. Just put some numbers on it really quickly using, you know, the best estimates we have of income per head in England. In the year 1300, we think income per person in Britain was about £780 a year in modern money. 1650, some 3.5 centuries later, £977 a year. Basically no growth, no change. You know, someone living in 1650, in many ways, if they're on a farm, their life's not that different to someone in 1300.
Pretty recognisable.
Yeah, pretty recognisable. You know, they'll eat quite a similar diet. They will wear, you know, the same sorts of clothes that they'll make. Their lives are quite similar. But after the Industrial Revolution, things begin to change. The world changes. People expect their children to be better off than they are. People's incomes grow. Population expands. You know, human mortality, you know, the death rate falls, fertility rates rise. We see something that starts to look like a modern world.
And people are immeasurably richer, you know, their material, their possessions, and their horizons as well, I guess.
Their horizons are, you know, they're living longer, they're eating better, they're eating more, their children are more likely to survive to, you know, become adults. They're going to live longer. They're living increasingly in cities and towns rather than in the countryside. They're less likely to be working in agriculture. Everything is different after the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so explain to me why, because before the Industrial Revolution, there was this idea that that resource is limited, and why how, because of the Industrial Revolution, do you just invent all that? Well, this is one of the great questions I've got. You're probably used to answering this. Do you just sort of go, oh, by the way, we've just invented trillions and trillions of dollars and pounds of stuff, which isn't related to land and bits of, you know, buildings. Yeah, well, let's go back to the world before the Industrial Revolution, and sort of the best description of it in economic terms comes in 1798, written by the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus. Economists tend to refer to this as a Malthusian world. And Malthus is, you know, as we'll come on to, in some ways not a very pleasant character. There's some suggestion that he was the inspiration for the character of Scrooge in Charles Dickens' Christmas Tales. You know, but keep Scrooge in your mind when we're thinking about Malthus. But his description of the world was pretty accurate. Now, for the only time in this discussion, I am afraid I'm going to use a tiny bit of maths. Okay, but you know, you've got an economic historian on. It's going to happen eventually. Yeah. So Malthus's great sort of insight, his description of the world was that human wants and the expansion of humankind tend to move in an exponential way. So that's 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. People can have multiple children. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, that sort of way. But human resources tended to grow in a strictly linear fashion. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, you don't need to be very good at maths to realise these two things are out of sequence.
So you plant a field, but you can't double the amount of planting.
Exactly, yes. Whereas two people can have two children very easily, but if they've got one field, they can't double the output from that field very quickly. So human wants, human needs tend to run in this pre-industrial revolutionary world ahead of the capacity to produce stuff, to produce food. And what that tends to mean is that when the population rises, the resources available to the people fall, income per head starts to fall, people start to get poorer. So you've got this sort of inverse relationship where a rising population tends to mean people are poorer, but a smaller population tends to mean people are a bit better off because they've got more stuff. Now, Dr. Malthus, and you'll see why people sometimes compared him to Scrooge, said, what keeps these two numbers in check? What keeps resources in line with the population? He thought there were two things that happened. There were what he called positive checks. They're not very positive. This is things like famine, plague,
run out. You hit the wall, and people just die.
People just die.
Yeah.
So what he advocated instead were preventative checks. Now, preventative checks meant either sexual abstinence or people getting married later, so they would have fewer children. He thought, what society should be doing is keeping population growth in check. Now, that's what takes him into this sort of miserly view that he thought, for example, charitable donations to the poor were a very bad thing.
Wow.
Because if you give the poor people money, well, they'll just have more children, and then there'll be more people and everyone will be poorer. The best thing to do is to keep population in check. So this is sort of the world he described. And the thing is, his description of the relationship between populations and incomes does seem to broadly, in the big picture, hold for most of human history until only a few hundred years ago. Periods of high population tended to mean living standards fell. And this is not to say, things were the same all of the time. They weren't. You would have good crops or bad crops or, weather patterns. Things would change, but it would change not very much, and generally around sort of a fairly static world of continuity.
But what's interesting is he was writing that at exactly the time, curiously, that this great revolution was beginning. First of all, very simply put, what is the Industrial Revolution? I mean, is it about us understanding how to... is it about harnessing the natural process on Earth, whether it's wind, coal, tide, to generate vast amounts of energy, and then the things we can do with that energy?
That's not a bad description. I'd start off by saying, this is a battle that I've lost before I was born. That calling it the Industrial Revolution isn't too helpful. Okay. I think industrial evolution makes more sense, because it's not like there's one moment that like a switch is flicked and suddenly you're in this industrial revolution world. And I think debating exactly when it happened is quite hard. But I think at some point between 1700, 1750 and the early 19th century, maybe 1820, at some point around that late 18th century, early 19th century, something changes in Britain. And fundamentally, it's about the ability to get more outputs from any given level of inputs. In economic terms, that's productivity rising. And it's partially about harnessing things like steam power. It's about being less reliant on human labour and using more machines, even very early machines. And by the end, we've moved to a factory system. We've moved to more intense forms of farming where we can get more food out of any given bit of agricultural land. We can produce far more cotton from the same level of inputs. We can travel faster. It's in some ways the invention of modern economic growth. This idea that, everyone will just, things haven't really been like this for the last 10 or 15 years, but in general, everyone will get 1.5, 2 percentage points a year better off every year, and that's just normal. And, getting 1.5, 2% better off a year might not sound like much, but that's 20, 25% in a decade. That's 50% in 2 decades. That's actually your income's doubling every 50 or so years. These are really, really, slow incremental growth. That starts with the Industrial Revolution. And the interesting thing is, it starts in Britain. And I think it's really important that it starts in Britain.
Yeah, well, let's get into it. I mean, why on earth does it start in this little rainy archipelago? Is it natural resources? Is it climate? Is it culture? What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, as you can imagine. Economic historians and economists and historians have been debating this ever since. So I think we can start off by saying, sort of climate and geography probably does matter a bit. Britain has a few natural advantages. Being an island really helps because moving stuff by sea is just cheaper and easier than moving stuff by land. And, Britain you're never that far from the sea anywhere on the island.
Lots of navigable rivers.
Lots of navigable rivers. And, classic example, moving coal from Newcastle to London is quite easy if you can put in a ship, take it down the coast and up the Thames. So that helps. Britain also, for such a small place, has quite a lot of variety of climatic conditions and land types, which allowed for a bit more sort of specialisation in different areas of the economy. Lancashire is quite rainy. That's done Blackpool's tourism industry no good in the last 50 or 60 years, but it turns out it's quite helpful when you're processing cotton. And lots of small, fast-moving streams, which allow you to use water wheels and harness water power. So and a lot of coal deposits, which are easy to access in Britain, relatively easy. They're close to the surface. So all of these sort of geographic things matter. But I don't think you can say it's just the geography, because the geography's been like that for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years.
That's true. The Romans were mining tin. Well, in fact, our prehistoric ancestors were mining tin, and coal was being mined as well. So it's always been there, right? Yeah. So what goes on there at that period?
So I think you've got a few other things happening. So you've got, I think, Britain's. Well, let's step back away from Britain for a moment. Let's talk about what some people call the little divergence. The little, this big thing in economic history, the Great Divergence, as people call it. That's when Britain and then Europe sort of decouple from Asia, from other regions. Europe, Britain become very, very, very rich in the late 18th, early 19th century, the time we're talking about. But something has happened before the Great Divergence, which, maybe a bit less important, so sometimes gets called the Little Divergence. And that's basically saying if you go back to 1500, the richest places in Europe are Italy, Spain, southern France, the areas around the Mediterranean. And they've been the richest place in Europe for well over 1,000 years. Right back to Roman times, the area around the Mediterranean has been Europe's centre of economic gravity, where there's the most trade, where people are the wealthiest. The climate is very supportive of various types of agriculture. The Mediterranean is easy to trade across. But at some point between about 1500 and when the Industrial Revolution starts, we see what people call the Little Divergence. We see Europe's centre of economic gravity move away from the Mediterranean and to the North Sea, to what was then still England and the Dutch Republic on the other side. So I think you've got to say, why did this happen? Why did the economy start to develop in a stronger way around the North Sea? And for that, I think we start with a couple of things. We firstly got the Black Death. Economists like this term, economic shock. You don't really get much more shocking than the Black Death.
Half the population of Europe?
Yeah, somewhere between a third and half the population dead. Obviously a huge shaking up. But in a Malthusian world, I mean, if you half the population, but the animals are still there, the infrastructure's still there, you've still got the same fields, well, you've half the population, you've still got the same resources, you'd expect people to be better off, and that does seem to be what happened. It's really sad news that your neighbour died of the plague, but now you can have their cow. sort of the world we're in. So you do get this jump in incomes, but that jump in incomes seems to sort of peter away after a few generations in southern Europe, but be a bit more persistent in northern Europe. And some people think, and I think it's definitely true, part of this is about institutions, about the character of the state in those areas. So if you think about early modern England and the Dutch Republic, they are, I would not describe them as small L liberal. I would not describe them as democracies. They're not like a modern late 20th century, early 21st century democracy. But neither are they sort of the authoritarian autocracies of France or Habsburg Spain. They're places where the political order is a bit more open, where monarchs are less absolute in their powers, where parliaments matter more, and where increasingly, particularly in the case of the Dutch Republic, but then also in England, where sort of commercial and sort of mercantile interests are starting to get a bit more say in government. Traditionally, if an English king wants to raise taxes, they need to summon a parliament, and that parliament will have a lot of sort of what we would call sort of middle class commercial lawyers, bankers, merchants. They're much more say in government, and this sort of more economic historians tend to call it an open access order. It's not a completely closed elite. These open access orders, these institutions, tend, in the long run, to be more supportive of economic growth. So I think you've got marriage patterns, you've got the climate, you've got this sort of institutional setup in England. That all points to something has changed in the Dutch Republic and in England. And by the 1600s, they're both recognisably commercial societies. Money is used quite a bit. There are people we would recognise as capitalists on quite a small scale. You're not into the Industrial Revolution yet, but you're in a different world to you were even just a few centuries before. And then it steps up again.
Presumably there's bits that might sound boring, but the essential kind of preconditions. So those sort of middle class people, they're interested in things like the legal system and protecting patents and protecting shareholders' investments and things. And the governments can't come in and go, I'll have that invention, or I'll take that off you. There's the beginnings of that sort of the nitty gritty.
Yeah.
On top of which you can build. So if you have an invention, you can be confident you're actually going to keep control of it and actually enjoy the benefit of it as well. Sell it, distribute it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then you've got this sort of strange conditions in England on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to keep saying England because most of this is just before the Act of Union and then becomes Britain during this process. But in sort of England and in early Great Britain, you've got this strange combination of factors. Wages are reasonably high, as far as we can tell, compared to other economies. And it's partially because of sort of the impact of international trade on England and Britain over the centuries. But for whatever reason, wages are a little bit higher. And the cost of borrowing is a little bit lower because we've started developing these stable institutions. And also coal, energy, is relatively cheap because it's very easy to get out of the ground in lots of parts of Britain. And just as importantly, coal is bulky and heavy, easy to move around the island using these waterways and the sea. And if you're in a world where wages, using people to do things is a bit more expensive, but actually the ability to borrow capital is quite cheap, energy is quite cheap, you are just incentivized to try and find ways. Is there a way I could be using a machine to do this rather than 5 or 6 people? And you've got this strange alignment of economic incentives in England and then Britain. And people, responded to that. And we get, really picking up pace throughout the 1700s into the early 1800s, these waves of inventions, which, we start to see the beginnings of modern economic growth. And you start to see more specialization. You start to see productivity slowly rising, and you start to see alongside that this huge change in the character of the country. And it really is a huge change. People, the majority of people living in towns and cities for the first time in Britain ever. And we've never gone back.
And on one basic level, I suppose, listening to you, replacing people with machines.
Absolutely.
Which is one of the key things we probably think about with the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. We live in a world of machines now, and we're all talking about it endlessly. But the issue of humans and robotics and things and drones and everything. But this was a conversation that started right back then. So if you're in farming or in shipbuilding, if you can involve machines or extracting coal from deep pits and draining out the floodwater that gathers there, you can use engines, you can use machines to do that job.
Yeah, absolutely. What we see is these sorts of ideas being applied to bit of the economy after bit of the economy. So you see huge changes in sort of metallurgy and, the ability to, make higher grade metals using, really powerful blast furnaces. You see this whole wave of inventions in the one people tend to talk about is the textile industry, which, before the Industrial Revolution, the textile industry pretty much relied on what was called a putting out system. So you'd have generally women working from home, doing sort of odd jobs to, add to the family income, someone coming around, dropping off the work, coming and collecting it. And within a few generations, we've moved to, boomtown of Manchester, just filled with factories, workers working on, machines, able to produce far more textiles than had been imagined by previous generations, and then them being exported. It's a vastly, vastly different world.
And so, I love going to the Quarry Bank Mill just next to Manchester Airport, and you see that originally that was, as you mentioned, Lancashire, that was, I think, water powered, wasn't it?
Yes.
Went to steam engine. And these amazing machines. So you're industrialising the process of creating textiles, and then quite quickly you're into a world that we recognise well today. If people make lots of money and other people want to emulate that, right? So, so sort of money and being able to keep hold. That's coming back to that thing about Englishness and Britishness. These entrepreneurs, these inventors, they're getting to keep what they've made. It's quite attractive to other people. You think, well, I want a bit of that.
Absolutely. So you say it's spread throughout Britain. So put some numbers on it. In 1801, sort of start of the 19th century, around a third of people in Britain lived in towns and cities. By 1851, it's more than 50%. And I think that's when we can say the Industrial Revolution in Britain has played out. We've become an urban society. Economic growth continues after that, and the urban percentage continues to rise. But this country has been fundamentally changed by what's happening. I think once you've no longer got the majority of your population directly living off the land, then I think we can start to say this is an industrial country, and Britain is the first industrial country.
And it's worth saying, because today factories are likely to be anywhere, but when we talk about cities, that's where workers would go and work in these huge workshops, these huge factories. They were concentrated together. They were
it's a pattern that we've seen play out in China over the last few decades. People leave sort of farming backgrounds. As they come of age, they move to a city. Nowadays it might be a rural worker moving to Shenzhen. Then it was a rural worker moving to Manchester or Birmingham. These cities which were growing enormously quickly. There were plentiful jobs available in these new factories. This sort of insatiable demand for workers in these factories at times. They would move there and they would work in these factories. And often, as you can imagine, the housing conditions were fairly grim. These were sort of knocked together quite quickly. Houses for these sort of urban workers who'd be working very long hours at times, but still, earning much more than they would have done if they'd stayed at home, on a farm.
What about the role of individuals? There's the economics, and you've painted that very clearly. What about this phenomenon that we see in Britain of often people who are self-taught, people who are not from a background of science, engineering and education, just inventing stuff? You've got the Stevenson with steam engine, you've got Newcomen, you've got Arkwright. You've just got these extraordinary people who are then networking and cross-fertilizing and competing, and then suddenly you're underway. That's a revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. And the interesting thing is, what we don't know is, were the ancestors of these people, similar 300-400 years earlier? If we go back to
were they back in the shed?
We just don't know. But this confluence of conditions in the 1700s that let them flourish. And you're right, they're absolutely right. They all feed off each other. Now, what's interesting about them is the vast majority of this sort of great pantheon of English and British inventors of this time, very few of them are sort of formally educated in sort of sciences. And actually most of them, you wouldn't say they were scientists if you looked at them now. They were mechanics. They were mechanics who worked on mechanical processes and worked in a sort of very iterative way, almost sort of tinkering all of the time. Finding out what worked until something did work, and when something worked, able to really, put it into production. So, the pace of change. One way I like to think about it sometimes is if you could transport someone just random person off the street from 1650 to 1750. Okay, people are wearing slightly different clothes and hairstyles have changed a bit and beards have gone out of fashion. But the day-to-day life, they could probably recognise it. If you took someone from 1750, dropped them in 1850, suddenly these huge cities, railways running between towns, the canal system, all of that. This is just an unrecognisable world.
But what's weird is there were people tinkering in Russia at the time, in Germany, in Botswana. Why? It's that funny question. What was going on this little island of ours? Why are these tinkerers? That they're seeing the rewards somehow. They're seeing the benefit. That there's a culture that's encouraging that tinkering.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's sort of the nearest. If you're looking at where would the Industrial Revolution have happened if it hadn't happened in Britain and England, I think you look across the North Sea to the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Republic is if anything, even more urbanised society. It's very, very commercial, big role for merchants and sort of commercial types in policy making, a more developed legal system, all of these attributes. Now, it doesn't have the easy access to coal, which probably makes a difference. But also, it's a small state on the European continent, really next to France. And I think this is one of those moments when actually, there is another benefit to being an island. That Britain is this, relatively stable. We've got to be careful that relatively stable state during this time, which is not directly threatened by invasion, and all of these things have come together, and the country got lucky, and it made a huge difference because Britain is the first country to industrialise. There is this moment when Britain is the only industrial country in the world when it is just much richer than anywhere else on the planet. And that lasts, it's like a half century or so of Britain just being staggeringly more productive, staggeringly economically stronger than anyone else.
And then you've got this funny debate that goes on because England and Britain was building this empire because of its position in the world as well, at facing the Atlantic, following the Spanish and Portuguese around the world, but then overtaking them. And did that help cause the Industrial Revolution, or did the Industrial Revolution help cause the empire?
I really think you're into chicken and egg at this point. I mean, the fascinating thing is, if you think, the shape of the world changes in the 1490s, early 1500s. For Europeans it changes. You've got, Columbus discovering the Americas. You've got Vasco da Gama rounding the Cape and finding another route to Asia. Now, what is really interesting is the countries which benefit from this are not Spain, Portugal, where these people came from, where they sailed from, where they sailed back to. It's the English and the Dutch who really benefit from this sort of new maritime trading economy. And yes, so, all of this sort of early English and then British colonialism, all of this early exposure to trade probably does impact the wage structure in Britain, which encourages people towards using more machines. But once you've got this, outsized economy in Britain, I think that's what really helps allow Britain to take on a truly sort of global role, to fight a second 100 years war against France, which you always remember, a much, much, much bigger country in population, to conquer an empire around the world. I think the two feed off each other.
What about for people? First of all, people back home knew they were in the middle of something crazy, didn't they? I mean, they were seeing it every day. It was commented on. It was written about. You felt like, I guess, as we do now with the digital revolution, you feel like you're a part of it. Was it popular? Did they like it? I mean, you mentioned all these people moving to cities and in terrible housing, and yet economically they're doing that for a reason. Are the normal men and women and kids benefiting from this industrial?
I mean, it's a really messy process. It's worth talking about the Luddites, Captain Ned Ludd, and these are in sort of Nottinghamshire, early 19th century workers whose job is going to be destroyed by this new technology. Rather than having dozens of people working in weaving, that job can be done by a couple of machines. So Captain Ned Ludd doesn't exist. He's like the person they say is leading this. The Luddites, these are people smashing up looms, at night, breaking these new machines, saying these machines are going to take away our jobs. We don't want them. I mean, they're clearly not very happy with this progress. Now, Right. A rather sort of cold and calculating economist, maybe a sort of Reverend Malthus type, would say it's going to be fine. Like, your jobs are going to go in the short run, but in the long run, everyone is going to be better off. Now, that it turns out to be true, but the long run can last a really long time. And, what we see in Britain, sort of the early 19th century, is this big rise in GDP, big rise in population as well. And this is a really important thing, that we're in a world now where the population can rise at the same time as incomes. But for an awful lot of people, it looks like they weren't feeling that much better off for a very long time. This is the time that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. Engels at the time was living in Manchester and sort of, observing conditions in this economic boomtown, saying, right, what's happened here is, these people that have come to work in these factories, they're subject to cholera outbreaks, to poor sanitation, to really long hours, to horrific industrial injuries at times, and they don't seem to be earning very much. This is sort of the time at which, Marx and Engels are, okay, we think this is going to lead to another type of revolution, but rather like Dr. Malthus, almost at the exact time they diagnosed this, things seem to change. And suddenly wages started to rise as well, and second half of the 19th century looks rather different.
Okay, interesting. So the working people start to benefit. We've already talked about, but again, this middle class is professional class. They're the engineers, the clerks. They're going to work in sort of managerial positions in these new giant factories. They're doing very nicely.
They are doing very nicely, and some people are earning absolutely huge fortunes as a result. It's during this time that, wealth stops for the first time, really, being based mainly on landholding. Landholding still matters, but you're seeing, other ways to become very, very wealthy. For industrial enterprises, all of that, and you start to see a shift in political power as well. That in a time when most wealth is fundamentally built on landholding, then obviously the nobility, who hold most of the land, tend to sort of dominate governments. And as the Industrial Revolution plays out, you start to see cabinets being less dominated by members of the House of Lords. You see the Commons becoming much more important, and wealth changes. And when wealth, once economic power has started to shift, political power starts to shift as well.
Yeah, so if you have a factory, it's churning out cash.
Yeah.
And it might be more valuable than a big estate where all you're doing is rearing sheep and agriculture.
And you see a lot of the old nobility obviously are very keen to get their hands in on this. A lot of sort of speculative investments in railways and all of that sort of stuff.
Whilst pretending to decry it.
Oh, no doubt, yes.
Absolutely galloping towards it. So politics change. I mean, this is the point. Really, everything changes. War. Politics, where the power and wealth lies in a society, our geography, how we live together in societies.
Yeah.
And I guess one other thing is, travel. I mean, people will be familiar with Brunel. Brunel is Eisenbart King Brunel is this engineer who almost sort of encapsulates, embodies this change. He grows. His father was actually a great inventor as well, and built one of the first mechanized assembly lines for the Royal Navy. But he puts in place things that we still recognise today in terms of communication. I mean, that must have just been extraordinary to witness that.
Absolutely. And it's things like one little change that comes with the Industrial Revolution, which is quite minor, but always striking to me about how much the world has changed, is for the first time, once we have rail travel, time across Britain has to be the same. Before then, you might have a village clock. You might, if you're lucky, you might have a village or a town clock, and anyone in that village or town, you can set your watch, if you have a watch, off that clock. Once a train is going to arrive at a certain time, then the time in Oxford has to be the same as the time in Bristol. So we get this sort of synchronisation of time. To me, that's just like a little change, but it's like for the first time, probably ever, time across England is the same after the Industrial Revolution.
And a huge change.
A huge change, yeah. It's the ability to travel via rail. It's utterly fascinating. There's a Times leader column in the early days of railway after, a member of Parliament managed to get themselves killed by one of the first trains. And I always think, the odds of getting killed by the only train in the world are fine, but it happens that. But after Hutchinson, the former minister, is killed by a train, the Times wrote, Now we will see the folly of travelling at 30 miles per hour. As we'll see again, trains will be travelling a lot quicker than that within not very much time,
long, yeah.
not very much time at all. But we're just in this very, very different world, and that actual rail travel, really allows cities to expand as well. So if you think of London, London, if you look, I'm always struck when you look at a map of London that it is basically the city of London, the city of Westminster, a few little villages and so forth around it. Once you've got early commuter rail lines in, then you can travel to work in 40-45 minutes on a small train. Suddenly the size of these places, the geographic size of them starts to grow as well. And you really, really see it in London as the train lines go out. So do the suburbs.
Is the kind of hot take about the Industrial Revolution, one of them is that actually, although it begins in Britain, it benefits Britain enormously initially. Ultimately, it also has the seeds of Britain's eclipse and downfall as a world power, because actually the place that benefit even more enormously are the enormous continental-sized land masses, Russia into the USSR, the United States, arguably Germany as well. So India, where the Industrial Revolution can knit together these places that are just super diverse, spread out. You can't if you rule over big chunk of North America before trains, before refrigeration, you can't really exploit that as much. So actually Britain unleashes this on the world, but then eventually will come to suffer a little bit.
Yes, you get this moment, which lasts a few decades, when it's pretty much only happened in Britain. And Britain is, this really is the time that Britain is fighting a lot of wars against France. And France's population is 50-60% larger, sometimes even more than that. But Britain's income per head is higher, so Britain is just as rich a country as France and can afford to fight these wars. But yes, the Industrial Revolution spreads first into sort of Western Europe, France, and then Germany. And second half of the 19th century, the really big shifts are the industrialization of North America, the United States, and Germany, which really, really rise to prominence as manufacturing powers. And then yes, in the 20th century, the Soviet Union, and in the final third of the 20th century, we see big developments in East Asia, starting with Japan and South Korea, and then China.
But that's what's so interesting, is it? Because the transformation of China that we've seen in our lifetime, that's the Industrial Revolution. That's it.
When you see those famous pictures of the Shanghai skyline 40 years ago versus today, and it's unrecognizable. That would have been Manchester at one point. Almost nothing there, and then suddenly this booming cotton town. Cities like Glasgow and Liverpool, which have always been there, but which really boomed during the Industrial Revolution, as sort of exporting ports for all of this cotton. Old towns and new. And a big shift in Britain. The most populous and the richest part of Britain before the Industrial Revolution would have been outside of London, East Anglia, where, good agricultural land. But then agricultural land matters much less in this new world, and it's Manchester, which no one had ever heard of. It's Birmingham. These are the real sort of economic centres of Britain.
We should talk about the environmental impact, because that's something we're now dealing with, because we didn't just change everything here on Earth and underground and in our oceans, but literally everything on the planet. We now realise that we adjusted the composition of our atmosphere, the acidity of our oceans. Extraordinary.
Yes, kicked off this period of mankind having a big marked material impact on the environment. Burning, so people have been burning coal for years. They hadn't been burning it on this sort of scale. And particularly on Britain started off, but then other countries follow, and we are still dealing with the circumstances now. It's interesting when you look at the British numbers that British emissions now are back to sort of mid-19th century levels, but they went a lot higher before being brought down, before we made changes in the kind of things we produce and how we produce them.
It is, but that's why the Industrial Revolution, the optimistic view would be that as that revolution keeps delivering us technological solutions, we will be able to start to fix some of the problems caused by the initial wave of burning fossil fuels.
And well, hopefully we'll get a similar wave of inventors who can feed off each other's ideas.
Yes, if there's any out there, let's get it.
Yes.
I guess the other thing is that nobody has been able to predict where all this goes. That's what's fascinating. And we're still in the amazing thing about the Industrial Revolution, I think we're still in it, really. There's, as you point out, there was all of human history before, and then there's the last 200 years, which, as we now know from AI and new inventions that we're talking about all the time, we're still in this kind of mad, and perhaps the speed's even picking up. I mean, who knows?
Who knows? I mean, if you want some sort of comforting lessons from the Industrial Revolution,
I do.
The comforting one is that, throughout human history and since the Industrial Revolution, mankind is yet to invent something which actually materially increases unemployment. So whenever you hear people saying the robots, used to be the robots are going to take our jobs and now it's AI is going to take our jobs, we have yet to invent something which ultimately puts people out of work. What tends to happen is a new technology, it's throughout the Industrial Revolution, has two impacts. It's got what people call the labour-saving impact, that you can do the same amount with fewer workers, so you don't need as many. So you can use fewer workers. But the people who are still in work now tend to be earning a lot more because they're more productive. They spend that money on other things, and that creates demand for new jobs. So you get these difficult transitional periods in which the Luddites might try and burn looms in Nottinghamshire.
In which people that write scripts for podcasts might try and blow up
exactly.
ChatGPT, for example. I'm just
exactly.
thinking about it. Yeah.
But let's talk about people that write scripts for podcasts. If ChatGPT can fulfill its sort of promise, and I'm not quite sure it can when I've played with it so far, but if it can fulfill its promise, if it can write a script for a podcast as well as humans, then okay, maybe rather than there being 10 people writing podcast scripts, there'll be one. But that one person will be earning an awful lot more.
Ooh.
They will go out and spend their money on something. And the 9 people who used to write podcast scripts will, go and work in new industries that we don't understand. This is the thing. Since the Industrial Revolution, this is a really important point. Since the Industrial Revolution, the normal state for the economy has been change. People do different jobs to what their parents did and to what their grandparents did. And their children will do different jobs to them. And that is normal and healthy and is how an economy grows. And sort of worrying that one type of job might not exist in the future, well, if you want to go back to the pre-industrial revolution world where the same jobs always exist and where your life looks quite similar to your parents, which looks quite similar to your grandparents, and your children's lives will look the same as you can do, but it wasn't a very pleasant world.
Okay, well, so at the end of it all, are you an optimist when it comes to this industrial transformation, this ongoing industrial transformation?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've spent a lot of time fretting about the possibility of these sort of revolutionary technologies shaking up our economy and our jobs market. But what we've had generally across the West for the last 15, 20 years is quite poor economic growth, not much productivity. Sort of stagnant incomes and wages most of the time across the West. And it's always seemed quite strange to me that we have 10 or 15 years of stagnant productivity and stagnant incomes whilst worrying that productivity might improve. And if productivity improves, yes, there will be some jobs that don't exist anymore, but economic growth is generally a good thing. Getting back to that world where people are getting 1.5%, 2% a year better off each and every year will make a big change. So, I'm not sure if it will happen, but I would welcome it if it did.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.